like to turn your attention to our guest. Brian P. Cavanaugh is an alum, graduate in 2008, both digital media as well as art. The work that you'll see downstairs he's going to talk about here in a little bit, so I won't talk too much about the work, but we're super happy to have him. After he left Albright, he went on to Pratt Institute and got his MFA in 2010. He has since been working as a designer, continuing his creative practice, but like many folks during the pandemic, had kind of a reality check. He also became a dad. His wife is an alum, graduate in communications, Heather, and we're just happy to have you. It's been certainly on my radar to have a show for you. You've been a protege, I know, of Matt's. We've had a show for Matt that we just saw, which was very interesting. So I also think it'll be interesting to kind of think about the work that you are doing in juxtaposition of the work that you're doing now, and see how that dialogue and conversation has changed. But you definitely have your own point of view, and that's what we're here to learn about. So thank you so much for being here. It's our pleasure to host
you. And could we dim the top? Thank you. As long as everyone's comfortable, I may unmask while I'm up here. Yeah. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for being here today. As David mentioned, my name is Brian Cavanaugh, and I am an alumni of Albright. When I was here, I studied fine arts in the painting department, and I also did a complete minor in digital media. When I left Albright, I enrolled in Pratt Institute, where I studied new forms. It is an interdisciplinary study which was very familiar to me, leaving Albright, and I split my time between the digital and the fine arts departments there. And that allowed me to explore a lot of different things, like video and installation, and a lot of things that I was doing here, but in a concentrated way. And it's there that I began to do things like interactive coding and some more programming. Now I work for an arts and immigration nonprofit. I'm a director of digital, and so I work with communications and marketing, advertising, and a lot of data. Over the years, I found that professional experience and my artistic practice are interwoven. They influence each other a lot. The data that I work with through storytelling, telling people's immigration stories and things like that, it influences my artistic practice, and certainly the work that I do in my artistic practice influences that work as well. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about my influences, and then talk about the works in the show. In November of 2020, Georgia Lupi, an information designer and partner at Pentagram, published this piece in the New York Times At Home section. It's called My 2020 in Data So Far. In the data visualization, Georgia documents changes in her life. Like, it's a personal timeline that tracks milestones, like the last time she did something when the pandemic hit, then the first time she started doing things again as everyone started to emerge from the lockdown. And I couldn't stop looking at this when I first saw it. I was really drawn to it. I studied it from an aesthetic point of view. I was drawn to the patterns and the mark making, how information was organized and arranged to tell a story. And at the time, we were juggling, like everyone else was, full-time work, childcare, at home, everything upended by the pandemic, just trying to be safe. And as David mentioned, I didn't create art during that time. It was like a mode of survival. We were transitioning to remote work, trying to stay employed, and trying to keep a toddler engaged at home, right? Moving from daycare to full-time working at home with kids. But I just stopped working creatively. And more than anything though, when I was looking at this piece during that time, what emerged and stuck with me was its honesty. The act of reflecting and recording lives in this way, as she did, was like the permission and the forgiveness to think about that time in our lives as these lasts and these firsts and agains. And then later in 2021, the Times published this interactive website, 7 questions of 75 artists in one very bad year. The questions were, did you make anything that mattered? Who and what comforted you? Which moments will you remember? Which ideas would you like to forget? What would a do-over look like? And what's still on your to-do list as normal comes into focus? And as I read these, and the answers are very different. They talk about wins and losses and struggles and milestones and everything in between. But it was a great source of inspiration and affirmation to be okay with where I was at that time. And as I said, an inspiration to create work from that period of lost time. Unfortunately, this is behind a paywall, as New York Times likes to do. But if you are able to see it, I recommend it. It's really cool. So when I began to think about my time in 2020, I referenced my photo library, I referenced my calendar, my phone, my digital life. I found myself working in these areas: data visualization, information design, quantified self, and generative art. These are areas that my art practice has been before, and where I continued, where it naturally led me. Quantified self is a movement, it's a community of makers and users of self-tracking tools. They're interested in self-knowledge through numbers. Some of my past work uses GPS location and things like tracking my cursor on my computer. And those are types of things that count as sort of quantified self. It's also a way to describe more low-tech ways of documenting the self. So using a journal or a spreadsheet to talk about what you're feeling, what time you might do something. All of these things would later become integral to the works in the exhibition. This is a piece by Laurie Frick. Laurie Frick is certainly an inspiration of mine. And she's a great example of someone who's working in the quantified self sphere. She uses self-tracking tools and things to track, mood, sleep, food, lots of things, travel. And then she constructs these objects in large-scale installations. And her background is really interesting. She spent a few decades in tech, working for software companies. And so she has a really interesting perspective that she believes people respond intuitively and emotionally to patterns, while she thinks numbers are more abstract and unapproachable. And this is one of the things I love about her work, not just that she uses really interesting objects like laser cut paper and felt and glass and things like that, but the way she's able to construct and develop these patterns to tell a story. And these are works by Casey Reyes and Ben Fry. Casey on the left, that's his work. Casey is a professor at UCLA, and Ben is a principal at Design and Software Consultancy. And together in 2001 at MIT, they developed processing. It's an open source programming language. And they set out to develop and share a way of working with code where things are figured out in the process. It's what they call sketching with code. And what became of that program, called processing, was another tool for generative artists. And generative art refers to algorithmic art at times. It's art created with the use of an autonomous system. So you write a code, and you write an algorithm, and you allow that algorithm to build and develop through visual terms, and then ultimately you might reach a point where you have a piece what you may call art. It's this program that they developed that has been sort of the foundation of my work for many years. Processing developed a lot since 2001, since I started using it after Albright. There are libraries built and supported by the community. There's an online editor now called p5.js, and they developed a foundation to promote software literacy. This is a screenshot from their website and what the code looks like. And then it's not as nice in the actual application, but they show a visual of what the code represents. One of my lasts before the pandemic hit was working with social media data, crawling and harvesting Instagram photos. I was collecting samples of thousands and thousands of photos that people shared on Instagram and used hashtags like happy, lonely, scared, excited. And I would harvest everything that I could. It's a lot of data. But I would analyze those colors that people, colors within those photos that people shared to explore patterns associated with those emotions. This is a piece called 12 Months of #happy, which tracked happy photos on Instagram throughout the course of a year. And this might be a little difficult to see. It's a large spreadsheet, but this is what the data harvested from Instagram looks like behind the scenes. So when you upload a photo to Instagram, there's a lot of data that exists behind the image, what they call metadata. And photo metadata is a set of information that describes the image. It's usually talked about in terms of like copyright, who owns the photo, what permissions are allowed. But it could also include a lot of other information, like the date that the photo was created in terms of Instagram, the username, the comment. It can get a little creepy. It has the longitude and latitude of where the photo was uploaded and shared, how many likes or comments. It has what filter was used. There's an incredible amount of information, and that's a whole nother talk about data privacy and what it means to participate in social media in that way. But this is the type of information that can be publicly harvested and then used to explore pattern. And the way in which I got this was I used automation tools, two specifically, Zapier and IFT, which stands for if this, then that. And those automation tools allow me to set up parameters and say, if a photo is uploaded with the hashtag happy, pull all that information. Retrieve the link to the photo, get all this information, and then create a new line in a Google Excel sheet, and then plug it all in. And it just runs automatically over time. It would also allow me to set geographical boundaries. So a project I did looked at interactive photos uploaded within a certain region of Brooklyn. And so I could say within this geographic region, pull all those photos and do the same thing. And those tools became really important as well. I also started to explore what the data values looked like in terms of color. And so I used processing to write a code that loads those images and then analyze every pixel. And pixels are the building blocks of a digital image. Pixel it stands for picture element. And you can think about pixels in terms of these colored squares. If you've ever zoomed in or pinched and zoomed in on a photograph far enough, the images become unrecognizable and you start to see something like this.
Every day.
Yeah, every day, which is frustrating, right? Like they're never enough high resolution images. The images that we often see, contain thousands and thousands, often millions of pixels. And so what the program and processing does is it creates an array. And an array is like this big virtual table or spreadsheet. And it starts and it goes through the image, starting with the top left, and it identifies every single pixel. And then it gets the color value of that pixel. And so if you're familiar with Photoshop or another photo editing tool, you might use like a color picker to select a color. And this is the same concept. It's just done at a different scale and in a different way. But that's what it does. It picks the color of that pixel, and then it stores it in a table called an array. But as I said, images contain thousands and thousands and millions of pixels. And so it's really hard to work with that much data. Impossible for me even. So the solution to that was to create groups of colors. So based on certain values that may be similar, the tolerance to which these groups are created can be adjusted. So in this, if this were an image, one of my color groupings may be 3. It may be an orange, a blue, and a yellow. If I wanted to be more specific, I could adjust that color grouping to be a little bit more detailed. So I get some more values of the browns and the violets, and some of the reds. And those color groups are stored in a separate array. And they're also analyzed by frequency. So how much of the image contains this color group of blue, for instance, and how much of the image contains that color group of yellow. And when I began the work that would later become the work in the show, I didn't need automation tools to harvest social data, but I did use those same concepts of identifying pixel and pixel color. I started to reflect on my time in 2020 by looking at my photo library, as I said, making sense of that time. And I did continue using spreadsheets, a lot of spreadsheets. This is a detailed view of At Home. It's one of the works in the show. It documents every day of 2020 and if a photo was found in my photo library or not. So from top to bottom, it's the first day, January 1, all the way down to December 31st. And if a photo was found, I created a spreadsheet and I asked myself questions. What is the photo of? Where was it taken? Who was I with? What's in the photo? How do I feel? And then I started working with color. I started analyzing the colors in the photo as well. So in this piece, every line represents a day, a photo. If there are spaces, those are days that there were no photos found. And the color of each line is determined by the most dominant color within that image. The solid lines represent a day spent at home, and the dashed lines represent a day spent outside of the home. I continue to explore this idea of at home and not at home through study for photo records. This time I used a lot more photos and a lot more of the color groupings within those photos. So in this case, I call them starbursts. Each starburst represents an image. And similarly, the colors of each line are represented by the color groupings within that photo. And the program starts by identifying a center point somewhere, and then drawing those lines out at a random angle. To create this piece, starbursts were drawn in groups based on the type of photo or the subject of the photo. So I grouped subjects like portraits, family, still life, screenshots from my iPhone, all in different sizes. And then I created variables that would choose random coordinates on this canvas or digital canvas each time a starburst was drawn. And then after several groups were done, I could export it as a PDF or vector image and then relayer them in Adobe Illustrator to create something like this. As I was working with the full library, which there were 7,870 photos, a nice even number somehow, I knew I wanted to look at pattern and time in a different way, to explore patterns of color. But as I began working to that end, I ran into a lot of technical constraints. I had photos taken from cell phones. I had photos saved from text messages. I've had photos saved from DSLR cameras in RAW formats. And one of the issues that came up is that the computer can process a cell phone image rather easily. Right? It's not that big. It's not that big of a file size. But a photo in RAW format can be huge. And if there are thousands of them, it becomes kind of impossible to process. So the first step that I did was I took all 7,870 photos and I created a batch process to get a consistent file size and format. So everything was put into like a JPEG, with I think 1,000 pixels. And it became much more manageable to work with. And so what the program does to create an image like this is it loads each image individually and records the groups of colors. And those groups of colors then become color histograms. Right? A color histogram is like a distribution of the colors within an image. It shows, what's the dominant color and less dominant color and so on until it reaches the color that's, just barely in that photo. And those histograms are drawn onto a digital canvas. The digital canvas is something that you can manipulate and change. So this one I chose to do a vertical canvas. And the program does it one at a time, one image at a time. It starts in the top left, and it goes all the way to the right until it reaches the end of the canvas. And then it jumps down to the next row. It goes all the way until the end. And so that negative space at the bottom, while intentional, not intentional, it was really a bit of an unknown. Because I had the overall size of the digital canvas. I knew how many photos there were. But depending on the size of the histogram rows, and overall the number of things, I didn't know where that last row would stop, if it would complete that row. And so those are the types of things that you can play around with in code and get very different results. One of the things I learned from studying social media data, Instagram photos, is that there are a lot of tones like these. A lot of the colors tend to be the same. There's a lot of tans and browns and things like that. And I didn't realize it when I first started working with data in this way. You certainly don't realize it when you're flipping through a spreadsheet or thousands and thousands of photos. But when you start to look at them individually, you see how many portraits people post. I found a lot of portraits in my photo library too. And so a lot of the colors seem muted and things like that. And at first glance, I certainly am not drawn to very muted tones like that. But then you start to understand what it represents and what it means and time spent with people. And then it starts to take on a different meaning. And so, that's one of the things I look at when I think about this piece or when I look at one of these pieces. And then other patterns start to emerge. Pops of blues, greens, possibly some reds and yellows, maybe from a brightly colored shirt or something. And it's it's in those little patterns that I'm really interested in exploring time. You can see sort of this process play out in this GIF. This is an example of one of my programs in processing, and the color histograms that I was just talking about. So each vertical column is a color histogram from a single image. The dominant colors, as I mentioned, are at the top. Those are the most dominant colors in those photos. And then the less dominant colors, and so on, until it gets to the very bottom. And they're very hard to see, but those are very small blocks. And this is actually, if the GIF contained everything, this would scroll through all 7,000, almost 8,000 photos. But what happens in processing, and you don't really understand it when you see a print, is that it draws one at a time, it processes one at a time. And then the code, or what I've developed in the code, is to have a variable to say, draw a histogram here, and then jump over that amount of pixels, that space, and draw another one, and then draw another one, until it reaches the end. And when it reaches the end, the program stops. It allows me to pause and think. It allows me to redraw if I want, and do it all over again, maybe change a bit of the code here or there. It also allows me to print. It prints in a PDF. And when I get a PDF, that means I have a vector image. And vector images, unlike raster images, like a photo in your phone, lets me scale really small or really large without any distortion. And I think Matt talked about vector images a little bit in his talk too. If you missed it, it's recorded. And then I could also continue the sequence. So if I hit, if I code, a key click or something like that, I can continue the sequence and it goes on to the next batch of images. What you see down on the bottom here is an example of the console in processing. And the console is really neat because it allows you to see the data that's being produced. Not in a visual term, but like in a technical term. And what I've done here is I've printed the color value, that's a hex value, and then the frequency, that's the frequency in which the color histograms are drawn. And I don't use that a lot, but for the purposes of showing this, I wanted to put that in there. This is one of the pieces that was created with a similar sequence. Can you all see it okay, the light? And when working with data, I think about authenticity a lot. Like, what does it mean to present a data set and how much I can manipulate that data and still retain its authenticity? Like, is it okay for me to omit a piece of data? Does a screenshot from my iPhone count as a photo as part of my photo library? And I don't know if there's a right answer to that. I definitely lean towards a light hand in representation of data, especially if I think it's skewing too far from the truth. But there are choices that ultimately affect the final image, the aesthetics of the final image. And those choices may be where to start and begin the image, or where to start and end the sequence to get a print image. It might be what types of color groupings there are, and so on. And I think those choices lead to a little bit of different visuals, like this one. 10, 15, 20, 20. So compared to the last image, these color histograms contain a lot more color groupings. And let me flip back here. So these color groupings had only a handful. And that allowed me to get these really dark tones kind of as dominant, and then these really brightly colored tones. And visually it seemed to pop. I was attracted to that a lot more. But if it contained the same number of groupings as this, it would look drastically different. So my process in creating these works is very exploratory. There's certainly a learning curve to coding. If you don't have a proper syntax, if the code is incorrect, it's not going to draw anything. It will give you a red flag and throw up warnings and scary messages. But once you have a working code base, you can begin to tweak things, and you begin to adjust the way a color histogram is drawn, or you can include empty data, when a photo was not taken or found in that photo library. And so in that way, I can create works, exploring different ways of time and pattern, but with 70% of the same code. And the works that we looked at so far have used a lot of my photo library to create a data set. And I was working with that much data. I thought pattern was best illustrated as more technical and in drawing-like forms. But there are other works in the show, like this one, record 0341 to 0342, where I only use 1 or 2 images. And what that allowed me to do is explore other concepts, painterly concepts like color and shape and form in a digital space. And these works were just created by distorting the pixels by rearranging them. So I didn't necessarily have to identify individual pixel color and store it in an array. I just had to take a pixel and move it around through code. And you can see it play out, in different photos containing different colors. This is record 1294. And what really stands out for me in these works is that I'm still working with an algorithm and code. Right, the general process is very familiar, distilling image down to pixels, but visually it's really different. And it kind of reminds me of working in the studio in a way which I haven't done really for years. So it's an area that I'm really interested in and drawn to. And this is a piece called Record 2810. It builds on the process, as the other works we just saw, by bringing forward parts of the original image. So you can see a figure in the bottom right. That's a picture of my son. The overall picture is based on a picture of my son too. But the pixels are distorted and rearranged, and then another layer is added to the code, and it brings forward some of that image through an image mask, allowing that subject to come through. And in this piece, 05/19/2020, 8 hours, this is what I referenced a little bit earlier about using my computer cursor and tracking movement. It's one of two works in the exhibition where I've done this, and it's created by tracking your mouse. The lines show the movement of your mouse over time, 8 hours, and the circles and dots represent periods of inactivity. So if the cursor stops, it starts to create a circle, and then it just calculates how much time you spend inactive. And so the larger circles represent times of a lot of inactivity. I might have stepped away or something like that. And so I do these from time to time, and I don't know if there's any real significance between my time in 2020 and say my time now. I have a feeling that there are a lot more of these smaller dots in periods of walking away because there were a lot of distractions at home. And certainly the larger ones too. So when I think about this time in 2020, which is difficult to do, right? Making sense of time in pandemic era seems to be upside down. I had a lot of assumptions. I thought we spent lockdown at home, trying to be safe as we could, locked away. But when I look at the works in the show and the patterns within the works, I'm reminded of my own lasts and firsts that Georgia, had developed in her own piece for the Times. I'm reminded of that naive optimism, early in 2020, that COVID wouldn't reach us. My wife and my family were traveling in the early weeks of that year, and then quickly followed by an abrupt lockdown, entirely changing our lives. And looking back through these abstractions that create sort of an autobiography, I'm mostly reminded about the gift of time, to be more present and spend time with that and with family in that way. And realizing that we weren't stuck in a small 2-bedroom apartment the entire year. Those pops of green remind me of times spent in the park, early morning, socially distant, or blues, seeing blue skies and being outside. And it's through this sort of artistic process and evaluation of pattern that I hope to pair that with data in the series and the works. So I hope you get to see it up close and personal in the Freedman Gallery. It's certainly different than on a projection, but we have a little bit of time ourselves if you want to ask questions or open it up for discussion. But thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Yes?
So you can only control parameters dictating certain things that bring in certain colors and stuff like that, but you don't control how it lays out the image by the time it comes out to final product, do you? You can control parameters that bring in certain things, but you can't actually control the final cut of things coming in. Am I correct in that? Like it's kind of randomized in its own way? Like you can say I want all these images and brought in these colors, but you don't have a final say on what the layout is, correct?
The layout in which it's drawn, certainly. I for instance created a vertical canvas here. Right. I created the histogram in this width and that height. The colors within that certainly are dictated by the different parameters.
Right.
And so to a certain extent, I go into it having an idea of what I'd like the output to be, what the visual to be. And then after the fact, like let's say this is 23 days, that's where my questions of authenticity come into play. Because there was no photo on this 5th day, and that was filled in, like everything was pushed over. And so when I was looking at this piece, I said, is that all, thinking about through the authenticity, like what does that mean? Do I need to have a space there? What does putting a space there do? And those are the choices then that, you edit the code or you edit it, in Photoshop later. Yes?
I have a question for you that's more conceptual than technical. So I find it interesting that you show that very diaristic piece, the Georgia piece from the Times, and it seemed very personal. And I'm wondering if you think that, working with algorithms and data in the way that you are, that you're taking something personal and making it impersonal, or do you not think about that?
I do think about that. Yes and no. I think certainly in some of these later works, I'm starting to bridge, or I'm starting to go down a different path in that way. Certainly, in these earlier works, not so much.
Not so much.
Yeah. It really depends, I think, on, it depends on what the data I'm looking at. Yeah. These works came later in the series after the other ones. And so I'd say certainly it's a direction of bringing more personal into it, but still relying heavily on that foundation of algorithmic art.
It's haunting.
Yes.
The wonderful thing about data is that once you get to a certain level, things sort of average out, and the distinctive selfie that somebody may have put on Instagram that really said who they were, it just blends into the billions of selfies that are generated, and that individuality washes away. And I was curious, I know somebody who has at least 7,000 pictures from 2020 as well, and I wonder if you were to perform some of the same data culling and algorithms on my library, would it be the algorithm speaking, or would there be some remnant of my own photographs still there in those color patterns?
Of you, yeah. It may be different to you than to another viewer. Mm-hmm. It may also depend on, it depends a lot on your photos too.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll certainly make...
So you could see the park?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I fully understand that someone else looking at it may not see a park. But I do hope they see changes in pattern, changes in time. Mm-hmm. And I think, taking your photo library as an example, certainly the same code applied to a different library, mm-hmm. It probably wouldn't look the same. It certainly wouldn't probably use the same code anyway, but if it did, then I'd probably want to look at the library and see what else to bring forward or what else to suppress. Because there's certainly a lot of times in this work when I did do that, and when I didn't see enough color or I didn't see enough pattern, in a certain sequence, and then I had to go back to that drawing board in the code and make some tweaks. Yes.
Not so much a question, but more, I guess, a compliment. But kind of reflecting on what you guys were saying about how when you make these, it kind of takes away a little bit of the individuality that you meant for it to be personal for you. But at the same time, when you do that, I noticed so for example, with the starburst and the cursor movements. So for those, my perspective perhaps might be a little personal in a different way. I'm a bio major, so I think those are just so beautiful because it reminds me of something that I would see under a microscope. So it might not reflect, okay, I was outside with my kid, but for me it reflects, this is me in the lab. So it's kind of personal in a different way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yes.
I got one more. Color theory is a fickle thing. Going through this, did you expect certain things to be the results and be completely thrown off, even though your code was correct on the results? Because you look at an image and you might think, oh, that person's got very skin tones, but reality is that if you go down to the pixel layers, it might be blues, or it might be greens. Because just color theory being color theory like it is, you see a color next to another color, it looks completely different.
Yeah.
So were you pleasantly surprised? Were you surprised by some of the results? Did you have to force some of the results? I'm curious about that.
I'm always skeptical about color theory and digital formats.
Yeah.
Color profiles for an image. And when I was talking about working with all of these pieces and creating a JPEG in consistent file format, being fully aware that, compressing and saving photos in this way might ultimately distort original data. So skepticism, certainly, but to get to the end, I was okay with it. But yeah, it's a hard thing to work with, and certainly there's another layer to that in terms of color theory and color profile for an image. Working with a photograph that has a format, that has a color profile, and then putting it into code, and then outputting another image, and then another layer beyond that, and creating a print, and CMYK from that. There are a lot of layers that it can get removed, and it's just a matter of referencing the data, for me, referencing the data, and trying to be as authentic as I can.
Very cool.
Yeah, thank you.
So, was there somebody?
No, it's you.
Oh, okay. At one point you showed us the piece where the counter is running and things are happening. Was that for our benefit, or is that how you would present it in your own installation?
I've done both.
You've done both?
Yeah. I'm showing it here for your benefit, but I've also shown not something exactly like this, but as an interactive piece where people can post photos to Instagram, and then I would harvest them in real time, or as close to real time as I possibly can, and then manipulate the color data and then put that back out, and in a different drawing like that. I've done that in two cases. One at a interactive art festival called Figment in Governor's Island, and also at the Brooklyn Infusion Center. It's a infusion center outpost by Memorial Sloan Kettering, and they do great work to bring in art and artists into one of their Brooklyn locations.
Nice, thank you.
Yes.
My other thought was that visual digital art is not the only art form that uses time and tone and color. And I'm wondering whether we could hear these images, that you could find a way to assign pitch or duration or musical qualities to this data, and I don't know, represent something equally random, equally chancy, equally mystifying and intriguing for people who couldn't see your pictures.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have somebody on faculty now who could probably do that, right? Is Mike here? Mike's not here, but maybe we'll introduce you to him, because I think he works with digital representation of all sorts, but mostly sonic, and I think you'll find this
Really
amazing.
interesting. Yeah.
Just amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Why do you do this? Why do you want to quantify data in this way?
Why do I put myself through this? It's a passion. It's just it's what I'm into. I love tinkering in code. I love learning new ways to make something out of code and get a visual image. But what I wasn't satisfied with was completely generative art. I wasn't completely satisfied with just building an algorithm and letting that build the visual by itself. And so that's when I started to work with data. And then when I was working with social media data, to John's point, I did run up against a wall where everything sort of lost a personal touch. And when I dove deeper into that, I realized that filters on Instagram make everything look the same. And so after that, I started working with personal data. And so it's really just been a progression of one thing to the next. But it's my jam.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
All right, fantastic.